Well, did you miss me? That's okay. I understand. In any event, this lecture session is for RL 221, Popes of Rome, History of the Catholic Church, which on your worksheets corresponds to week 9.1 and 9.2, and for RL 225, the course Mystics, Saints, and Sinners, Studies in Medieval Catholic Culture, corresponds to week 9. We left off last time. I am hoping, that's okay if you didn't, but I'm hoping that you realize that last time where we ended, the Magna Carta, all that was the story of Robin Hood. Robin Hood. And just as an aside, if you're interested, you really should be making and taking more time to follow the video lecture sessions. But if you're interested, there was a very good movie that came out several years, 5 or 7 years ago, called Ironclad. It's very violent and graphic, but it's very historically accurate, both in its choreography, its scenography, as well as the historical facts of the situation at the time. Just FYI, Ironclad, it's called. Okay. With that said, we also said that the Magna Carta, the impact was so great that it wound up instigating the Fourth Lateran Council in the same year, 1215. The 12th Ecumenical Council out of a total of 21 in the history of the Catholic Church. Fourth Lateran Council, as in, again, St. John Lateran Palace and Basilica here in Rome, which is where the popes lived and had their residence and had their offices until the 15th century, the 1400s, which we'll come to in a later lecture. And they moved everything, they transferred everything to the Vatican itself, also here in the city of Rome, obviously. So the Fourth Lateran Council, still with our friend Pope Innocent III. And for our purposes in this course, the first thing they decide to do, again, looking at your outlines, your worksheets, taking your notes, the first thing they decide to do is to no longer allow any new religious orders. Of course, at this point, there's only two. The monks, the order of St. Benedict, the monastic system, and again, it's internal reforms, the Cistercians and the Carthusians, and that kind of strange warrior religious order, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. They decide that things have become just too unruly. Remember, we have to keep control. So this council decides no more religious orders. Ironically, as they decide this, there happen to be two little guys sitting in St. John Lateran Basilica while the proceedings of the Fourth Council are going on, the Fourth Lateran Council, who will wind up completely upending that apple cart, so to speak, to which we're coming in a moment. Okay, so that's the first thing. No new religious orders. It disrupts, it disturbs, it complicates our system, and more importantly, our control of that system. The second thing, there are reforms made, and they're legitimate, against corruption in general. So reforms enacted against lay investiture, the practice of simony, No word mentioned of the buying and selling of indulgences. What remains today, the Roman Catholic, and for that matter, the Eastern Orthodox doctrines and dogmas, in the case of the Roman Catholic Church, regarding Eucharistic transubstantiation. Namely, that when the Eucharist is confected, when the priest consecrates the host during the divine liturgy of the Eucharist, the Mass, that somehow that host becomes Jesus Christ, divine and human, incarnate once again. And by incarnate, we mean fully divine, fully human. Fully human, we actually mean flesh and blood, even though it remains a wafer of unleavened bread. In the Roman Catholic tradition, actually leavened bread in most of the Eastern Orthodox traditions. Thirdly, Trinitarian theology. Famously, a guy named Peter Lombard is given credit with establishing, after this point, what remains specifically the Roman Catholic Church's teaching on Trinitarian theology, the Trinity. He plagiarized everything from our friend Tertullian, and for that matter, Cyprian, that we already discussed earlier in the course, in the 3rd century. But, hey, whatevs. Finally, a variety of laws enacted, legislation enacted concerning relations between Christians and Jews and Muslims. Back to those two strange, uninvited kind of guests that I just mentioned a few minutes ago. No new religious orders. Well, it just so happens that two guys show up saying, we have an idea for a new religious order. Those two guys are the Spaniard Domingo Guzman, in English Dominic, later Saint Dominic, and the Italian Francesco d'Assisi, Saint Francis of Assisi. And they come up with a new idea for propagating the Catholic Church, Christianity, Christian theology, Jesus Christ. Both of them are real, very ardent believers, sincere, seemingly so. And they say, we're not into the whole war thing. So Knights Templar, Knights Hospitaller, that's not our thing. And secondly, after all of these centuries, and thankfully for the efforts of the monastic movement, the monasteries, we're kind of thinking that things are becoming rather corrupt in all of these institutions. We're losing our way. We're losing our focus. We're forgetting the whole reason that we presumably are involved in this in the first place. That is, in the cliched wristband world we live in, WWJD. WWJD. What would Jesus do? Right? What would Jesus do? And these two guys come up with what at the time was considered a radical idea, saying, you know what? Not in a war. We're not going to go crusading. And why should we be self-contained, living within the walls of a monastery and expect people to come to us? Of course, they're going to come to us if they're poor and hungry and they need something, clothing, material goods, or even spiritual comfort. But at this point, we're in the early 13th century, the early 1200s, and maybe it's time we stepped out of our box. As the Doobie Brothers sang in the, I guess, late 70s, taking it to the streets. And so these two guys come up with a radically new concept for religious order, which is referred to as the Mendicant order. The Mendicant movement, from the Latin term mendicare, to beg. Sustaining oneself by what people give you physically, monetarily, financially, or material in the sense of just saying plain food. In other words, these guys say, you know what? Yeah, we like the idea of the monastery. I mean, we should be all on the same page, more or less, and live together. But why should we just stay together, closed up in our monastery? Maybe we should bring the idea of these so-called evangelical councils from the New Testament, the ideals of Jesus, the gospel values. What would Jesus do? Maybe we should go out of the monastery and meet people wherever they may be, farming their fields, grazing their livestock, smithing, horseshoes, whatever. We should go out. The Mendicant movement, and consequently the Mendicant religious orders. These two guys, Dominic and Francis, who knew each other. They were contemporaries. They were together here in Rome at this time to try to get their ideas accepted by the Roman Catholic Church. They were on the same page in terms of their goal and their overall mission, that is going out, missio, not staying confined, self-contained in a building, a structure. But their approaches were very different. Dominic's idea was through education, as we would think of today, notwithstanding the debacle which is the academic industrial complex and the politicized elements therein. That is education, teaching people. That is to say, if I can tap the mind, the intellect of someone through my logical, rational expostulations, argumentations, explanations, I can then tap their heart, which will lead to a conversion of the soul and the human person to Jesus Christ. Dominic, tap the mind first. Consequently, when he's asked, well, what do you want to call this thing? He says, I don't know. I guess it's a new order. So, Ordo Praedicatorum in Latin. Order of preachers. Order of preachers. Not the, on a street corner at midnight in some seedy neighborhood. Well, that could be as well, but preacher in the sense of teacher. That is, I'm preaching, but the idea is that I'm teaching you something which is presumably logically rational and comprehensible. And in that process, your heart will be moved, which consequently moves your soul, which consequently moves your whole being, your whole human person to Jesus Christ. Okay, so the order of preachers, St. Dominic, abbreviated OP. Usually referred to popularly as the Dominicans, the Dominican order, as in St. Dominic. His contemporary, and yes, admittedly his friend, the Italian Francesco d'Assisi, St. Francis of Assisi, had a different approach. He said, with all due respect, Dominic, I'm really hardcore. And what would Jesus do? Well, I'm going to take this all the way. I'm going to read and meditate upon the life and times of Jesus of Nazareth as I've heard proclaimed in church during the Divine Liturgy, the Eucharist, the Mass, and what I read of the New Testament. I'm going to go radically back to living, just radically living out these so-called evangelical counsels, especially poverty. The idea being that I'm not going to first tap the mind, I'm going to try to go directly to the heart of the individual. And by tapping the heart, then the soul, and the rest of the human person follows in this process of conversion. How do I tap the heart? Not preaching through my words, logical reasons, rationale, etc., but primarily through how people experience me living all of this out. And consequently, he comes up when he's asked, well, what do you want to call your idea? And he says, well, does it have to be in order? Francis says, yeah, it's got to be in order. All right, so the order of, in Latin, fratrorum minorum, lamely translated, but accurately into English as friars minor. What the hell does that mean today in 2020? Friars minor. Lesser brothers, the least of my brethren. That is, I am going to live as Jesus lived. I am going to live radically with the poor as one of the poor. And that if others see that happening, others experience that immediately, directly for themselves, my example, if you will, not really example, but this radical way of doing this, then they too, they're directly to the heart, their souls will be transformed and they will come to a life in Jesus Christ. Okay. These two new orders, we just had the same council that they're attending where they're, imagine them sitting there saying, when the Pope or his vicar or whatever says, and furthermore, there will be no more religious orders. These two guys are just sitting there saying, shit. Well, as it turns out, actually shortly after the council convenes, Pope Innocent III dies. His successor, Pope Honorius, I think the third, Pope Honorius III. Anyway, they give them approbation temporarily, tentatively, and these new religious orders. They said, well, let's see what you can do. Can you manage this? We'll give you a try. And actually, before the century's out, at the next, not the immediately next, but further ecumenical council to which we're coming briefly, will in fact formally approve these two new religious orders, the Mendicant orders, taking it to the streets. Again, as the Doobie Brothers famously sang. All right. That brings us then to this council where these two orders were formally approved, held in a small town called Lyons. Lyons. Again, it sounds better in French. Lyons. In the south of France. It's the year 1274. This is actually the 14th ecumenical council. There was one in between Lateran IV, and this second council, it'll be the second ecumenical council held in Lyons, one in between the Council of Vienne, but we're not worried about that for our purposes in this course. So this 14th ecumenical council, the second council of Lyons, to begin with, they, on paper, for the umpteenth time, formally recognize a real unification between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. It looks good on paper. Secondly, they formally recognize these two new mendicant orders, the Dominicans and the Franciscans. Just as an interesting aside, both most famous Dominican and Franciscan of this period, the 13th century, the Dominican Thomas Aquinas and the Franciscan Bonaventure, were present at this council. Well, technically, Thomas Aquinas dropped dead on his donkey, or I guess mule horse, on his way to the council. Bonaventure was present for the council, but he dropped dead while the council was going on as well. Thirdly, looking at your worksheets, your notes, this is the first time that now all modern, or what are becoming, have become, or are becoming modern nation states in Europe, they're not only all present, but they're formally present. That is, either the monarch, because that's the only thing we got going, that's the only form of government. Remember, de jure pontificio, de jure divino, notwithstanding the Magna Carta from last lecture session. So either the monarch, the sovereign temporal ruler himself, or at least a significantly high-ranking legate, ambassador, emissary, vicar for them standing in their place is present. So all of Europe, as we think of Europe today, is present. And it's in the context, mind you, of an ecumenical council presided by whom? The Pope, who is also Pontifex Maximus. All right. This is an interesting twist that I've never understood why church historians and, well, theologians I can understand because they do theology. But church historians, this is always glossed over, and this has always fascinated me. At this council, not just Europe is represented, they invite a group who shows up that, if you think about it, would never be expected, I suppose. Namely, 13 Mongolians. No, I'm not talking about cooks or waiters at your favorite kind of American Asian fast food buffet. I mean, like Mongolians, as in Genghis or Genghis Khan, the great horde coming out of Mongolia, Central Asia. And their Khan, Abukar Khan, I think his name is, and he has a delegation. They show up at this council, an ecumenical council in the south of France. Why? Before you get to the why, get this. At least the Khan himself, the Mongolian king or chieftain, and presumably several other members of the entourage, they're baptized as Christians, which, if you know anything about the Mongolians, they really didn't, it's arguable, it's debatable how fervent they were in their newfound faith and religion. So then why would they go through this? Why would the Mongolians go through this? Maybe they found it funny. Why would the Christians insist upon this? Wow. Get this. Think about what's going on. We're still in the 13th century, the late 13th century, the late 1200s, 1274. to be precise, at this council. Where are the Mongolians coming from? The Far East, China, Mongolia. Where is this council being held? Medieval Europe, Christendom. Do we recall what other rather large geographical, political, economic, military, religious entity happens to be between Mongolia, China, the Far East, and Europe? The Islamic Caliphate. And so at the Fourth Lateran Council, the Mongolian horde and medieval Christendom forges an alliance against the Islamic Caliphate. Finally, on this particular point one, number one here on your worksheets, your notes, regarding this council anyway. It just so happened, and I hope once again, thinking about what's going on today as we literally speak, and which is the impetus for why we're not in class together, and we're doing this remotely online. There was also another invited guest at this council. Actually, a guest and a host. Its name, in Latin anyway, Yersinia Pestis. Yersinia Pestis. Pestis. As in, who was it? Camus' famous Le Peste. The plague. The bubonic plague. The Black Death. This is one of the ways in which it got introduced into the European continent. Not the only way, but certainly one of the ways. To which we'll come back in a moment. Finally, the council ends. And after a couple of more popes, we come to the year 1300 and Pope Boniface VIII. And Pope Boniface VIII will do a couple of things. He will take the idea of de jure pontificio, as well as the practice of the buying and selling of indulgences, and maximize it to a point that at this point had not yet been seen.